Hey, we're up here in the vinyl attic for another episode of Vinyl Fetish, where we are counting through the 100 albums that must be in your collection. It's still hot and steamy here in Portland, Oregon. I've got the AC window unit in. Try to keep the vinyl from warping because it's more important that I keep the vinyl cool than I keep my kid cool. I did not say that. So we're doing these 100 albums. We're doing an album that they're all these albums are near and dear to my heart. That's the point. But this one is especially special. I'm so excited. We're finally going to talk about Sonic Youth, 1986 Evol, their third album, first album on SST. This was a record that was kind of revolutionary for many reasons. So we want to talk about Sonic Youth and why this record. Some people call it EVOL. You know, it's love backwards, but in my little circle, we've always called it Evol. So Sonic Youth came out of the New York no wave scene, really inspired by the kind of dissonant music of bands like Teenage Jesus and the Jerks, which is Lydia Lunch's band, and the Contortions, which was James Last's band. James Last, who just died last month. Also inspired by a lot of avant-garde jazz like Sun Ra and Ornette Coleman. Also inspired, of course, by the Velvet Underground and the noise that they were making. And also Yoko Ono. Yoko, who is still with us. And this idea of deconstructing music as noise, as auditory sensations. And the first couple Sonic Youth records were very noisy. You didn't put them on looking to dance. You put them on for like a sonic experience of this just sort of barrage of sound. Very influenced by Glenn Branca, who I got to see in 1983. I actually wrote the press releases for the Glenn Branca show at 688, who would have multiple guitars tuned differently, all playing different things at the same time, and it was just like this wave of music. So Sonic Youth was really kind of a niche listen for a lot of people. You know, we started in the early 80s thinking about this thing of post-punk. What comes after the Ramones and what comes after the Sex Pistols, and this sort of noise genre that was starting to emerge in bands like the Butthole Surfers and Dinosaur Jr. and just stuff that was a little more dissonant. They were a part of this New York scene. The No New York album that came out in '78, I think, produced by Brian Eno, was really captured that kind of New York underground bohemian noise thing. And they were putting out these great records, very heavy and dissonant. And then they were in L.A. and there was a great story in Kim Gordon's book. Kim Gordon, the bass player of Sonic Youth. This is a great book about gender and rock. A girl in the band. This album, this book made me a little less affectionate toward Thurston Moore, who's kind of the leader of Sonic Youth. Kim and Thurston were married for the majority of the band, and it didn't end well. And you get sort of the inside scoop about how women fit into the male-dominated world of rock and roll. But she tells this great story in here on the chapter on Evol about they were in L.A. And went to a house party that Black Flag was playing at. Because in New York, nobody lives in houses. There's no house parties. People live in apartments and lofts and things like that. So there was this house party in L.A. that Black Flag is playing at. Henry Rollins in his, black trunks, rocking out in this house. And they just totally loved it. And they met some of the SST folks there. And then sort of switched to SST Records, which was, had been the sound of L.A. punk in the early 80s, and SST wanted a sort of a wider audience. Sonic Youth wanted to bring some of the LA punk vibe in, and so they joined the SST label and started working on this album, which was recorded in Brooklyn. But it's kind of the bridge album to the more commercially sounding Sonic Youth that a lot of people got to know. And when this album comes out in May of 1986, it gets some new ears because it's a little bit more melodic. There are longer songs on this album. Expressway to Your Skull is this great long. There's a lot of to me. There's a lot of Charles Manson. I remember I got this record right when it came out in 1986. I remember thinking this was like some weird Charles Manson soundtrack about killing the California girls, but it was really about killing pop music with their music. There is some references to Madonna, Sean Madonna and me. While they were in L.A., one of the people they met was Mike Watt of Minutemen and D. Boone. We've talked about the Minutemen on this show. D. Boone died tragically in a car crash, and Mike Watt was going to give up music, and they brought him on board. He actually plays bass on a couple of the tracks that were recorded for Evol, and convinced him to stay in music. And then he went on to form the band Firehose. Great story behind Firehose. Maybe we'll talk about Firehose. They ended up playing with Sonic Youth on a tour. But this record really, for me, is the ascent or the rise of Kim Gordon. That her vocals and her contribution to this record, because she comes in, she wasn't a trained musician. She could barely play her bass. You think of like Stu Sutcliffe of the Beatles, was just there to make noise. But she really comes into her own in a very Patti Smith kind of way. The track "Shadow of Doubt" is like nothing else. It starts off low and scream and atmospheric. There's a lot of reverb on this record. It's a great record to listen to late at night. It's got sort of a horror theme on it. This is from a kind of indie horror film, and created this whole new sound. And they were on SST, and I picked this up, and it's been a while since I held the physical copy in my hand. And I just sort of pulled out a bunch of stuff. I used to shove stuff in records back in the day. So this is the vinyl, very simple vinyl. And then because it's SST, you would get all kinds of stuff, on SST that you want to know about. First of all, this sort of semi-weird zine-looking, very zine-looking for the 80s lyric sheet. And then what else is in this vinyl album? You get books by Henry Rollins. There's the SST reading list, SST catalog. This is how we didn't have the internet in those days, so we really depended on stuff shoved into records to tell us what was cool. Guns or Record, an SST survival guide. So this is all the stuff. And then also in here was a flyer to the show at the Metroplex in Atlanta. This is the first time I saw Sonic Youth when they were touring with this record with Flatbush, September 16th, $6 at the Metroplex. Pristine condition because it was saved inside the album. And so in fact, one of the things about this record I kind of forgot about is that Lydia Lunch co-wrote one of the songs, who was sort of one of their heroes from the no wave movement. I got to know Lydia in the 90s. I actually opened up a few shows for her in Atlanta and Athens, and then saw her when I moved to Portland. She and I and Exene Cervanka from X went out to dinner. That was an interesting conversation. I think we talked mostly about the Unabomber that night. But one of the reasons I wanted to highlight this album, besides being kind of a monumental shift in underground music that starts to turn people on to stuff that's not very structured, that's all about deconstructing music, there is a real gender story here too as well. We have all these great bands that have sort of a female member, Talking Heads, probably being the most famous example, and where they are allowed to be in the male-dominated world of rock, and how they, because of that sort of internal oppression, create some really amazing moments of creativity and art. I think Kim Gordon, who went on to create a great clothing line, and write and continues in the world of music. I think some of that sexism that she experienced generated some of that response that is just sort of the most punk rock thing in the world. I love this record. It's so atmospheric. It so creates a mood. They went on. The next album, Sister, that came out the next year, was sort of more of the same. I always think of it as sort of the second part of Evol. They were working with Mike Watt on a project called Chicone Youth. So they had an album out in early 1988 called the Whitey album. It was sort of, the underground was very in love with Madonna. Let's just be honest. We all loved Madonna in a way because she came from the underground in New York and then became a big thing. So everybody in the punk rock scene sort of had a soft spot for Madonna. And the Ciccone Youth Project, the Whitey album, is the version of Into the Groove is amazing. And then the record that they had out in the spring of 1988 was Daydream Nation, their double album. And that was the record that started to get them some attention in the MTV world. And the tours became bigger. This is also when the grunge scene is happening in New York, and bands like Nirvana and Soundgarden and Mudhoney, and so that's all being lumped together. There's a documentary about sort of this underground thing all of a sudden becoming huge and big, and I certainly saw Sonic Youth. I can't count how many times I've seen them. I certainly saw them every single tour. I think my favorite show, besides that Metroplex show, is seeing them in the parking lot of the Tower Records in San Francisco, and they just smashed everything. They just smashed a lot of noise, the old Pete Townsend bit. I love this record, and if you love records that don't really fit anywhere, that don't really have a genre, where does this go? Is this punk rock? What is this? Sonic Youth Evol is a great journey through sort of a soundscape that was created by these four people. Steve Shelley was the new drummer in the band, Lee Ronaldo doing all these weird tunings on the guitar, and of course Thurston Moore. They're great. It's a great record. Some of this stuff you just have to experience. It's like talking about jazz. They're just the words don't do it enough. But I wanted to include them in our 100. Sonic Youth needed to be there. So Evol, 1986, great record. Kim's book, a must-read, especially if you want to find out how to create spaces for women in music. Love this one. Okay, next time we've had 3 Fabs. We've had Paul, we've had Ringo, and we've had George. We need to get John in there. We're going to do a John Lennon album next on our 100 albums that must be in your collection. We're going to do Walls and Bridges, which is a great, great record to have on vinyl. I have all kinds of things to say about that record. But in the meantime, I'm not letting go of this. This album matters. Sonic Youth matters. Kim Gordon super matters. The music matters. You matter. Let's talk about it.